Welcome, dear friends, to a heartwarming story about love, loss, and the unexpected twists and turns that can bring a family together. Enjoy the story. The harsh, fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital's break room did little to soften Natalie Anderson's delicate features as she nervously twirled a strand of her chestnut hair around her finger. Her emerald eyes darted towards the door, anticipating the arrival of the man who had captured her heart and complicated her life beyond measure. As if on cue, Dr. Oliver Blackwood strode in, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Natalie, and a smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Natalie," he breathed, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. "I've been thinking about you all day." Natalie's heart raced as Oliver's strong arms enveloped her. She allowed herself a moment of weakness, burying her face in his chest and inhaling his intoxicating scent, a mix of expensive cologne and antiseptic. "Oliver," she whispered, reluctantly pulling away. "We can't keep doing this. What if someone sees us?" Oliver's brow furrowed, a flash of hurt crossing his chiseled features. "Why are we still hiding, Nat? I'm tired of sneaking around like teenagers. I want to shout from the rooftops that I love you." Natalie sighed, crossing her arms protectively over her chest. "You know why. I have Sophie to think about. She's still adjusting to the divorce, and if she found out I was dating her favorite doctor—" She trailed off, shaking her head. Oliver ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "Sophie's a smart kid. She'd understand. Hell, she might even be happy for us." "Or she might feel betrayed," Natalie countered. "Oliver, you're the head of pediatrics. You've been treating her asthma for years. What if she thinks this has been going on the whole time?" Oliver's shoulders slumped in defeat. He took Natalie's hands in his touch sending shivers down her spine. "I understand your concerns, I do. But Natalie, I can't keep living like this. I love you, and I want a future with you." Natalie's breath caught in her throat as Oliver dropped to one knee, fishing a small velvet box from his pocket. "Natalie Anderson, will you marry me?" Tears sprang to Natalie's eyes as she stared at the glittering diamond ring. Everything she'd ever wanted was right in front of her. A good man who loved her, security, a chance at happiness. But the image of her daughter's betrayed face flashed through her mind, and she hesitated. "Oliver, The break room door suddenly swung open, and both Natalie and Oliver jumped apart. Anna Chen, the bright-eyed young intern, burst in, her long black ponytail swinging behind her. "Dr. Blackwood, we need you in the ER, stat. There's been a multi-car pileup on the highway, and we've got incoming traumas." Oliver shot Natalie an apologetic look as he pocketed the ring and straightened his white coat. "We'll finish this conversation later," he promised, squeezing her hand before rushing out the door. Natalie slumped against the wall, her heart pounding. How had her life become so complicated? As a single mother and dedicated nurse, she'd sworn off relationships after her messy divorce. But then Oliver had swept into her life like a whirlwind, breaking down her carefully constructed walls with his charm, kindness, and unwavering support. Now, faced with the prospect of marriage, Natalie felt torn between her love for Oliver and her duty to her daughter. As she composed herself and prepared to return to her shift, she couldn't shake the feeling that her entire world was about to change, for better or worse. 2 days later, Natalie found herself in Oliver's spacious office, ostensibly to discuss a patient's case, but as soon as the door closed behind her, Oliver's professional demeanor crumbled. "Natalie, please," he implored, reaching for her. "I need an answer. I can't eat. I can't sleep. I'm going out of my mind wondering if you'll be my wife." Natalie's heart ached at the pain in his voice. "Oliver, I love you. You know I do. But there's so much to consider. Sophie, our careers, and—" She hesitated, biting her lip. "And what?" Oliver pressed, his intense gaze boring into her. Natalie took a deep breath. "And your past, Oliver. There's still so much I don't know about you. How can we build a future together when there are so many secrets between us?" Oliver's face darkened, and he turned away, staring out the window at the bustling hospital grounds below. For a long moment, silence hung heavy in the air. "You're right," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. There are things in my past that I've tried to forget, things that still haunt me. Natalie approached him cautiously, placing a comforting hand on his arm. Tell me, Oliver. Whatever it is, we can face it together. Oliver's shoulders sagged as he began to speak, his words coming out in a rush. It was 5 years ago. I was married to a woman named Rebecca. I thought we were happy, but... He swallowed hard. She was having an affair with my best friend. Natalie gasped softly, her heart breaking for the man she loved. When I confronted her, Oliver continued, she lashed out. She accused my father of sexual harassment, demanding a huge sum of money to keep quiet. It was all lies, of course, but the stress, it was too much for my dad. He had a massive heart attack. Tears welled up in Oliver's eyes, and Natalie instinctively wrapped her arms around him. Oh, Oliver, she murmured, I'm so sorry. The divorce was ugly, he went on. Rebecca took everything. But the worst part, after Dad recovered from the heart attack, he disappeared. Just vanished without a trace. I searched for months, hired private investigators. But, Oliver's voice broke. I never found him. Natalie's mind reeled as she processed this revelation. Suddenly, so many things about Oliver made sense. His dedication to his patients, his fierce protectiveness, his reluctance to open up about his family. Oliver, I had no idea, she said softly. Thank you for trusting me with this. Oliver turned to face her, cupping her face in his hands. Now you know everything, Natalie. All my demons, all my baggage. I'm not perfect, but I swear to you, I will spend every day of my life trying to make you and Sophie happy, if you'll have me. Natalie's heart swelled with love and compassion for this complex, wounded man who had laid his soul bare before her. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a frantic knocking at the office door interrupted them. Anna burst in once again, her face flushed with urgency. Dr. Blackwood, Nurse Anderson, you're both needed in the ER immediately. We have a situation. As they hurried towards the elevator, neither Natalie nor Oliver could have imagined how this emergency would change their lives forever. The emergency room was a flurry of activity as Natalie and Oliver arrived. Nurses and doctors rushed back and forth, the air thick with tension and the metallic scent of blood. What's the situation? Oliver demanded, effortlessly slipping into his role as the authoritative head of the department. Anna fell into step beside them, her voice low and urgent. Male patient, approximately 60, 65 years old, found unconscious in an alley downtown. He's in bad shape, malnourished, dehydrated, multiple lacerations and contusions, but that's not the worst of it. What do you mean? Natalie asked, her nurturing instincts already kicking in. Anna's expression turned grim. He's homeless. 2 other hospitals already turned him away. They said they didn't have the resources to deal with someone like him. Oliver's jaw clenched, a fire igniting in his eyes. Not on my watch. Where is he? Anna led them to a curtained-off area where a team of nurses was working feverishly around a gurney. As they approached, the acrid smell of unwashed bodies and stale alcohol assaulted their senses. Natalie's heart clenched as she took in the patient's appearance. His matted gray hair and beard were caked with dirt and blood. His clothes, if they could be called that, were little more than tattered rags clinging to his emaciated frame. Jesus, Oliver muttered, quickly assessing the situation. All right, people, let's move. I want a full workup. Blood panels, tox screen, Connecticut scan. Check for internal injuries and signs of infection. And for God's sake, get him cleaned up. As the medical team sprang into action, Natalie noticed several of the nurses exchanging uneasy glances. She overheard one whisper to another. Great. Another junkie taking up space and resources. Anger flared in Natalie's chest. She stepped forward, her voice ringing out clear and firm. This man is our patient, and he deserves the same level of care and respect as anyone else who comes through those doors. Is that understood? The chastened nurses nodded, avoiding her stern gaze. Oliver shot Natalie a look of pride and gratitude before turning back to the patient. As he leaned in to examine a particularly nasty gash on the man's forehead, something made him pause. A flicker of recognition passed across his face, so brief Natalie thought she might have imagined it. Oliver? She asked softly. What is it? He shook his head, his brow furrowed in concentration. Nothing. It's just, there's something familiar about him. I can't quite put my finger on it. Before Natalie could press further, the patient's eyes flew open, wild and unfocused. He began thrashing on the gurney, his hoarse voice crying out incoherently. "He's going into shock!" Oliver shouted. "We need to stabilize him now!" As chaos erupted around them, Natalie caught fragments of the man's desperate ramblings. "Agnes! I'm sorry. My boy. Forgive me." She froze, her mind racing. Agnes? Why did that name sound so familiar? But there was no time to dwell on it. The mysterious patient's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and every second counted. The hours ticked by as Natalie, Oliver, and the medical team fought to stabilize their mysterious patient. Finally, as dawn broke over the city, his condition improved enough for them to move him to a private room in the ICU. Natalie slumped against the nurse's station, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Oliver approached, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. "You were amazing in there," he said softly, pressing a cup into her grateful hands. Natalie managed a weak smile. "You weren't so bad yourself, Dr. Blackwood." They sipped their coffee in companionable silence, both lost in thought about the night's events. Suddenly, Natalie remembered something that had been nagging at her. "Oliver," she began hesitantly. "When the patient was delirious, he kept mentioning a name. Agnes. Does that mean anything to you?" Oliver nearly choked on his coffee, his face draining of color. "What did you say?" Natalie's heart raced at his reaction. "Agnes. He kept apologizing to someone named Agnes. Oliver, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Oliver set down his coffee with shaking hands, his voice barely above a whisper. "Natalie, Agnes is my name. My real name." "What?" Natalie gasped. "But I thought—" "Oliver is my middle name," he explained, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Agnes was the name my grandfather gave me. It's Lithuanian like he was. But growing up, everyone had such a hard time with it that I started going by Oliver. Eventually, it just stuck." Natalie's mind reeled as she processed this information. But then, how did our patient know that name? "Oliver, is it possible?" Before she could finish her thought, alarms blared from the ICU. They rushed to the patient's room to find him thrashing in his bed, his eyes wide with panic. "Dad?" Oliver breathed, frozen in the doorway. Natalie's heart stopped. "Oh my God," she whispered. The patient's wild eyes locked onto Oliver, a flicker of recognition passing through them. "Agnes?" he croaked. "My boy, is it really you?" Oliver stumbled forward, tears streaming down his face. "Dad? Where have you been?" As Natalie watched the emotional reunion unfold, her nursing instincts kicked in. She gently guided Oliver to a chair by the bed, then busied herself checking the patient's vitals and adjusting his IV. "I'm so sorry, son," the older man sobbed, clutching Oliver's hand. "After the heart attack, after everything with Rebecca, I couldn't face you. I was so ashamed." "Ashamed?" Oliver choked out. "Dad, none of that was your fault. I searched for you for so long." Natalie's heart ached as she listened to their broken conversation. Years of pain, guilt, and misunderstanding poured out between father and son. "I never did those things she accused me of," Oliver's father insisted weakly. "Never. But I couldn't bear to see you hurt anymore. So I left. Thought you'd be better off without me." "How could you think that?" Oliver's voice cracked with emotion. "Dad, I needed you. I've always needed you." As the 2 men clung to each other, Natalie quietly slipped out of the room to give them privacy. She leaned against the wall outside, her mind spinning. How was it possible that after all these years, Oliver's long-lost father had ended up in their hospital, on their shift? The enormity of the situation hit her like a tidal wave. This changed everything. For Oliver, for their relationship, for the future she'd been so unsure about just days ago. Taking a deep breath, Natalie squared her shoulders and headed for the nurse's station. There was work to be done, arrangements to be made. Whatever came next, she was determined to be there for Oliver every step of the way. In the days that followed, St. Mary's Hospital buzzed with barely contained gossip. The story of Dr. Blackwood's homeless father had spread like wildfire. each retelling more dramatic than the last. Natalie did her best to shield Oliver and his father, whose name, she learned, was Edward, from the worst of the speculation. She rearranged schedules, redirected nosy visitors, and fiercely guarded their privacy. A week after Edward's admission, Natalie found herself in his room, checking his vitals as Oliver dozed in a chair nearby. The older man's health had improved remarkably, though years of neglect and hard living had taken their toll. "You're very good to my boy," Edward said softly, his eyes twinkling with a hint of his son's charm. Natalie smiled, adjusting his pillows. "Oliver's a good man. He makes it easy." Edward nodded, his expression turning serious. "I've made so many mistakes, hurt him in ways I can never make up for. But seeing him with you, it gives me hope." Natalie felt her cheeks flush. "Oh, we haven't—" Edward chuckled weakly. "My dear, I may be old, but I'm not blind. The way he looks at you, that's love if I've ever seen it." Before Natalie could respond, a small voice piped up from the doorway. "Mom, is that Grandpa Edward?" Natalie whirled around to see her daughter Sophie peeking into the room. Her heart leapt into her throat. "Sophie, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be at your father's this weekend." Sophie shrugged, her curly pigtails bouncing. "Dad had to work, so he dropped me off. Nurse Anna said I could come up." Her curious gaze landed on Edward. "Are you really Dr. Oliver's dad?" Edward's face lit up at the sight of the little girl. "Indeed I am, young lady. And who might you be?" "I'm Sophie," she declared, marching into the room with all the confidence of her 8 years. "Dr. Oliver's my doctor. He makes my asthma better." As Sophie chatted animatedly with Edward, Oliver stirred in his chair. His eyes widened as he took in the scene before him. "Sophie?" he said, his voice thick with sleep. "What's going on?" Natalie moved to his side, speaking low. "I'm so sorry, Oliver. I didn't know she was coming. I can take her home if—" Oliver silenced her with a gentle squeeze of her hand. "No, it's okay. Look at them." Natalie turned to see Sophie perched on the edge of Edward's bed, giggling as the older man regaled her with a story from Oliver's childhood. "And then," Edward was saying, his eyes twinkling, "little Ollie decided he was going to perform surgery on his stuffed bear, used his mother's best scissors to open up the poor thing's belly and stuff it full of cotton balls." Sophie dissolved into peals of laughter. "Did you get in trouble, Dr. Oliver?" Oliver chuckled, moving to sit on the bed. "Oh, you bet I did. But that's when my parents knew I was destined to be a doctor." As Natalie watched the three of them together, Oliver, his father, and her daughter, something shifted inside her. The fears and doubts that had plagued her seemed to melt away. This, she realized, was what family looked like. Messy, complicated, but full of love and second chances. Later that evening, as they walked Sophie to Natalie's car, Oliver pulled her aside. "Natalie," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "seeing you with my father, with Sophie, I know things have been complicated between us, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He dropped to one knee, pulling out the ring he'd offered her weeks ago. "I'm asking you again. Will you marry me? Will you help me build a family, with all of us?" Tears sprang to Natalie's eyes as she looked at the man before her, the man who had been her colleague, her friend, her lover, and now, she realized, her future. With a heart full of love and hope, she gave him the answer she'd been too afraid to give before. "Yes," she whispered, pulling him to his feet and into a passionate kiss. "Yes, I'll marry you, Oliver Agnes Blackwood." As they embraced, Sophie's excited squeal pierced the air. "Does this mean I'm getting a new dad and a grandpa?" Laughing through her tears, Natalie scooped up her daughter. "It sure does, sweetheart. It sure does." Weeks later, Natalie stood in front of a full-length mirror, hardly recognizing the radiant bride reflected back at her. Sophie danced around her in a flower girl dress, while Anna, now a close friend, made last-minute adjustments to Natalie's veil. "You look like a princess, Mom," Sophie exclaimed. Natalie smiled, her eyes misting over. "Thank you, sweetie. Are you ready for your big job today?" Sophie nodded solemnly. "I've been practicing my flower throwing all week." A knock at the door interrupted them, Edward poked his head in, looking dapper in a tailored suit. Is the bride ready? It's almost time. Natalie took a deep breath, smoothing down her dress. I'm ready. As the wedding march began to play, Natalie took Edward's arm. He'd made remarkable progress in his rehabilitation and had insisted on walking her down the aisle. Thank you, she whispered as they prepared to enter the church. For everything. Edward patted her hand, his eyes shining with unshed tears. No, my dear, thank you for giving my son and me a second chance at family. The doors swung open, and Natalie caught sight of Oliver waiting for her at the altar. His face lit up with a joy so pure it took her breath away. As she walked towards her future, Natalie's heart swelled with love and gratitude. Life had thrown them all some cruel curveballs, but somehow, against all odds, they had found their way to each other. And as Oliver took her hand, ready to pledge their lives to one another, Natalie knew that this was just the beginning of their greatest adventure yet.